The crystal spires of the Galactic Council rose like frozen lightning against the purple sky of Centauri Prime. Lieutenant Marcus Drake stood at attention in the center of the vast chamber, his polished United Earth Forces insignia catching the light from the bioluminescent panels above. 50 pairs of eyes stared down at him from the towering crystalline benches, some multifaceted, others singular, but all filled with the same cold disdain. High Counselor Vex, his chrome-plated exoskeleton gleaming, leaned forward from the central podium. Lieutenant Marcus Drake of Earth, you stand accused of gross violation of First Contact Protocol 447B, emotional interference in a diplomatic mission of critical importance. Drake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. I stand by my actions, High Counselor. A ripple of disapproving clicks and whistles echoed through the chamber. To his left, a delegation of quantum-linked synthetics flickered their display panels in what Drake had learned was their expression of disgust. You abandoned your post during the Centennial meeting with the Nexus Collective, Vex continued, his metallic voice growing sharper. You violated a secured chamber, interfered with an ongoing negotiation. And for what? The High Counselor's optical sensors narrowed to pinpoints of blue light. To save a single irrelevant juvenile life form. That irrelevant life form was a child. Drake shot back, his composure cracking. She was suffocating in a ventilation malfunction, while your precious negotiation droned on about trade routes. Another wave of murmurs swept the chamber. A crystalline being to Drake's right shattered, and reformed its upper layer. A sign of extreme agitation. And there, Vexus said, almost triumphantly, you reveal the very flaw that makes your kind so dangerous. Emotion. Instinct. The very things we have evolved beyond. The High Counselor rose, his exoskeleton wearing. Your actions nearly disrupted a treaty 3 decades in the making. The Nexus Collective saw your display of sentiment as a sign of dangerous instability. Drake clenched his fists. That display of sentiment saved a life. If that's instability, then maybe the galaxy needs a little more of it. Typical human response. A voice chimed in from the upper tiers. Counselor Zena, her holographic form shimmering with barely contained irritation. They mistake their evolutionary baggage for virtue. The Council has reached its decision, Vex announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Lieutenant Marcus Drake, for your crimes against Galactic Protocol and your continued defense of primitive emotional response, you are hereby sentenced to exile. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Drake had expected prison, maybe even mind-wiping. But exile. That was reserved for the worst offenders. You will be transported to Nexus 427, Vex continued, and Drake's blood ran cold. Everyone knew about Nexus 427, the Death World. The planet that had killed every survey team ever sent to its surface. The Council feels this is appropriate, Zena added, her holographic lips curving in what might have been a smile. You choose to save one life at the cost of a crucial treaty. Now you will learn the true cost of letting emotion guide your actions. Drake looked around the chamber, at the beings who had sacrificed their capacity for empathy on the altar of progress. He straightened his shoulders, meeting Vex's gaze. You know what the difference is between us, Drake said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. You see emotion as a weakness because you've forgotten its power. You've forgotten that every great achievement in history came not just from logic, but from passion, from care, from the very things you've carved out of yourselves. The teleportation field began to hum around him. Vexus raised his chrome-plated hand. Lieutenant Marcus Drake, your sentence begins now. May your final moments serve as a lesson to any who would let their primitive instincts override galactic law. As the field began to brighten, Drake smiled. It wasn't the reaction they expected, and he saw several council members shift uncomfortably. At least I'll die human, he said. which is more than I can say for any of you." The light flared, and Marcus Drake vanished from the chamber, leaving behind a council that would soon learn just how wrong they were about the power of human emotion. The teleportation field's light faded, and Lieutenant Marcus Drake found himself gasping in Nexus 427's purple-tinged atmosphere. His military training kicked in immediately as he scanned his surroundings. Twisted crystalline trees stretched toward 3 moons, their translucent branches casting prismatic shadows across the alien landscape. A sharp crack echoed through the crystal forest. Drake dropped into a defensive crouch, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. The Council had stripped him of everything except his standard-issue environmental suit. "Right," he muttered, voice tight in the dense air. "Survival first. Self-pity later." The ground trembled. Something massive was moving through the forest, breaking crystal branches like twigs. Drake's eyes widened as a shadow passed over him. A creature at least 20 feet long, its scaled hide reflecting the moonlight like polished obsidian, a twilight reaper. The stories hadn't done them justice. The beast moved with impossible grace for its size, each step calculated and silent despite its mass. Its head bore a crown of crystalline spines, and multiple eyes arranged in a predatory pattern swept the area with methodical precision. Drake held his breath. The creature hadn't spotted him yet. Then a high-pitched keen split the air, and his blood ran cold. Where there was one Twilight Reaper, there was always a pack. 3 more shapes emerged from the crystal undergrowth, moving in perfect formation. Drake had studied enough pack predators to recognize their strategy. They were hurting him. He broke into a sprint, crystal shards crunching under his boots. The Reapers moved like living shadows, each taking a different route, but all heading to the same point. They were steering him toward what looked like a dead end, a wall of crystal formations that rose like jagged teeth. Then he saw it, a small gap between the crystals, barely wide enough for a human, but far too narrow for the Reapers. If he could just. A juvenile Reaper burst from the ground ahead of him, its smaller frame tangled in what looked like living crystal quicksand. The creature's keening changed pitch, becoming something Drake recognized from 1,000 different species: fear, pain, a call for help. He had a clear path around it. The gap in the crystal wall was right there. Every logical part of his brain screamed to keep running. But he saw the way the other Reapers hesitated, saw the distress in their synchronized movements, heard the change in their calls from hunting cries to something more desperate. "Oh, this is a terrible idea," Drake growled, already turning back. The adult Reapers watched, their multiple eyes fixed on him as he approached their trapped young. The crystalline quicksand had nearly reached the juvenile's breathing vents. Drake grabbed a broken crystal branch, testing its strength. "Okay, kid. Let's see if your family appreciates emotional decisions more than the Council did." He extended the branch to the trapped Reaper, using it as a lever to keep the young creature's head above the quicksand. Its eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Drake felt something. A brush against his mind, like static electricity against his thoughts. The adult Reapers moved closer, but not to attack. They began using their crystalline head spines to dig around the quicksand pit, working with a coordination that spoke of intelligence far beyond what the Council's reports had suggested. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, the juvenile broke free. It scrambled up, shaking off the crystalline residue, and did something that made Drake question his sanity. It bumped its head against his shoulder, like a cat marking its territory. The rest of the pack gathered around, their earlier hunting aggression gone. The largest one, presumably the pack leader, lowered its head to Drake's level. Those multiple eyes studied him with what he could have sworn was curiosity. "Well," Drake said, carefully reaching out to touch the crystalline spines, "either I've just made some friends, or this is going to be the most ironic death in galactic history. The pack leader's response was to gently nudge him toward a path he hadn't noticed before, one that led away from the crystal dead end and toward what looked like more hospitable territory. As Drake followed his new escorts, he couldn't help but smile. How about that, Council? Looks like emotional decisions might just keep me alive after all. 3 weeks into his exile, Drake learned that even apex predators had their own predators to fear. The warning came as a resonating howl that shook the crystal trees, different from the Twilight Reaper's usual calls. His pack, and he had started thinking of them as his pack, immediately formed a defensive circle. "What's got you all spooked?" Drake asked, reading the tension in their crystalline spines. The pack leader, whom he'd named Shadow, nudged him toward a cave entrance. But before they could reach it, the air itself seemed to ignite. Crimson stalkers erupted from the underground, their bioluminescent markings pulsing with battle light. They were smaller than the Reapers, but more numerous, their bodies covered in razor-sharp crystal formations that could slice through even the Reaper's tough hide. The fight exploded around him. Shadow and the pack moved like a well-oiled machine, their telepathic coordination allowing them to predict each other's movements. But the Crimson Stalkers had numbers on their side, and they fought with a savage intelligence that made them lethal opponents. Drake knew he should hide, should run. Instead, he found himself grabbing a crystalline spear, a fallen fragment from one of the Reaper's head crests. When a Crimson Stalker tried to flank Shadow's blind spot, Drake was there, driving the crystal shard into its sensory cluster. The battle shifted. The Reapers adapted their strategy, using Drake's smaller size and mobility to their advantage. He became their ground support, disrupting the Stalkers' coordination, while the Reapers struck from above. Then everything went wrong. A dying Stalker's crystal formation exploded, sending shards flying in all directions. Drake felt white-hot pain as a fragment the size of his forearm punched through his environmental suit and into his side. He stumbled, the world spinning as his blood painted the crystal ground. Through blurring vision, he saw Shadow tear through 3 Stalkers to reach him. The rest of the pack formed a protective ring, their roars now carrying a note he'd never heard before. Not hunting, not warning, but something almost like fear. As his consciousness faded, something strange happened. Maybe it was the blood loss. Maybe it was some property of the crystals now embedded in his flesh. But Drake felt his mind expand. Suddenly, he could feel the pack's presence not just around him, but inside his thoughts. Their minds were alien yet familiar. Complex emotional landscapes painted in scents and sounds he had no words for. He felt their concern for him, their rage at the Stalkers, their fierce protectiveness. Most surprisingly, he felt their recognition of him not as prey, not even as an ally, but as pack. Shadow's mind touched his, and Drake finally understood how the pack communicated. It wasn't just simple telepathy. It was a full emotional and sensory network. Every pack member contributed to a shared consciousness, each adding their unique perspective to create a complete picture of their world. And somehow, his human brain, with all its primitive emotional depth, was compatible. Drake laughed despite the pain, blood bubbling on his lips. The Council, they were so wrong about everything. The pack carried him back to their den, moving with incredible gentleness. The juvenile he'd saved, now named Swift, brought him crystal fragments that glowed with healing energy. Another pack member used its own blood to create a sealing agent over his wound. As he drifted between consciousness and delirium, Drake remained connected to the pack mind. He felt them taking shifts to guard him, felt their relief when his fever finally broke, experienced their joy when he managed to eat. When he finally regained full consciousness 4 days later, the connection remained, not just with Shadow's pack, but with others too. distant minds glowing like stars in his consciousness. He could sense other packs, other species, all connected in a vast network he was only beginning to understand. Drake placed his hand on Shadow's crystalline crest, feeling the thrum of the pack bond. "You know," he said, a smile playing on his lips, "I think the Council did me a favor. They tried to exile me to die, but instead, they helped me find my true pack." 6 months after his near-fatal encounter with the Crimson Stalkers, Lieutenant Marcus Drake stood atop a crystal spire, his mind extended across the landscape like an invisible web. Shadow, his pack leader, lounged behind him, her crystalline crest catching the light of all 3 moons. Through the neural network, Drake felt the approach of a massive crystal behemoth, a living mountain of crystal and muscle that usually kept to the deep underground. The beast was fleeing something, its mind broadcasting panic across the telepathic web. "Easy, big one," Drake projected, using the emotional language he'd mastered. The behemoth slowed, its fear mixing with curiosity at this strange 2-legged creature who could speak mind to mind. Images flashed between them. A cave system collapsed, territory lost, hunger and desperation. The behemoth was seeking new hunting grounds, specifically the rich crystal fields where the Twilight Reapers fed. In the old days, this would have meant war. The Reapers would have defended their territory. The behemoth would have fought back, and both species would have suffered heavy losses. But Drake had learned something revolutionary about Nexus 427's ecosystem. It wasn't just about survival of the fittest. It was about connection. He reached out further, touching the minds of the void wraiths circling high above. Their aerial perspective showed him 3 uninhabited crystal fields, rich with the minerals both species needed. A path existed, if they were willing to cooperate. "Shadow," Drake called both verbally and mentally. "I need your help with this one." The pack leader rose, her multiple eyes focusing on the approaching behemoth. Through their bond, Drake felt her initial territorial instinct, then her growing understanding of his plan. She learned to trust his unconventional solutions. Drake created a mental bridge, something that should have been impossible according to every xenobiologist in the galaxy. He connected the behemoth's crystal resonant mind with Shadow's pack-focused consciousness, letting them share perspectives directly. The behemoth experienced the Reapers' hunting techniques, their ways of finding the richest crystal veins. In return, Shadow learned how the behemoth's burrowing actually created new crystal formations, enriching the hunting grounds for future generations. You see, Drake projected to both. You're not competitors. You're part of the same cycle. The negotiations, if you could call emotional exchanges between apex predators, that lasted through the night. By morning, they had a solution. The behemoth would create new crystal tunnels connecting 3 hunting territories. The Reapers would share their excess hunting grounds, and in return, they'd gain access to underground shelters during the deadly solar storms. As Drake watched the behemoth begin its work, carefully crafting tunnels under Shadow's watchful eyes, he felt a profound shift in his understanding. The Council had seen this world as nothing but a death sentence, its creatures as mindless killers. They'd been so wrong. These beings had rich inner lives, complex societies, and an capacity for cooperation that rivaled any civilized species. All they'd needed was someone who could bridge the gap, someone whose mind was both emotional enough to connect and adaptable enough to translate. A mental ping caught his attention. Swift, the young Reaper he'd once saved, was approaching with news. Through their connection, Drake saw what had the juvenile so excited. A pack of Crimson Stalkers was requesting a meeting. "They want to learn the new way," Swift projected, his mental voice tinged with pride. "They say the peacemaking alpha has changed the laws of the world." Drake smiled, reaching out to feel the vast web of minds now connected across the planet's surface. Predator and prey, hunter, and hunted, all finding new ways to coexist through the power of shared understanding. The council thought they were punishing me, he said to Shadow, who rumbled in agreement. Instead, they gave me the chance to prove that evolution isn't just about becoming more logical. Sometimes it's about becoming more connected. The three moons set, and Nexus 427's purple sun rose over a world that was changing, one mental bridge at a time. The first warning came from the Void Wraiths. Drake felt their alarm pierce through the mental network like lightning, their aerial perspectives flooding his mind with images of massive ships breaking through Nexus 427's upper atmosphere. Behind him, Shadow's crystalline spines bristled with tension. Galactic Resource Corporation, Drake muttered, recognizing the distinctive hull markings. Should have known they'd show up eventually. Through the network, he could feel the rising anxiety of every connected species. The ship's engines were already disrupting the delicate crystal harmonics that many creatures relied on for navigation. The lead ship, a monstrous Harvester-class vessel, settled over the northern crystal plains. Its landing struts crushed ancient crystal formations that had taken centuries to grow. Drake winced as he felt the pain ripple through the mental web. Those crystals had been part of a vast underground network used by the crystal behemoths for communication. A sleek corporate shuttle descended near Drake's position. He stood his ground, Shadow and Swift flanking him like honor guards. The shuttle's door hissed open, and out stepped a woman in an immaculate corporate uniform, her eyes hidden behind data scanning lenses. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, her voice carrying the artificial smoothness of someone used to boardrooms rather than wilderness. "Lieutenant Drake, I presume. The Council's famous Exile. I'm Director Lynn Caldwell, GRC Operations. This territory is protected," Drake said simply, feeling Shadow's low growl rumble through the ground. Caldwell's smile didn't waver. Protected? By whom? The Council designated this planet as a resource acquisition zone months ago. No sentient life, no civilization, no claim. She gestured to the massive ships above. "We have 17 harvesters ready to begin mining operations. The crystal deposits here are some of the purest in the galaxy." As if to emphasize her point, the nearest harvester powered up its mining laser. The beam struck a crystal field, and Drake's mind exploded with pain as hundreds of connected beings felt the destruction of their communication network. "Stop," he shouted, both verbally and mentally, his psychic command strong enough to make Caldwell stagger despite her having no telepathic abilities. "Those crystals are part of a living ecosystem. You're not just mining resources, you're destroying the foundation of an entire society." Caldwell regained her composure, but her smile had turned cold. "Lieutenant, I can appreciate that isolation has had an effect on you. But these are animals. Dangerous ones, according to every survey. What you're perceiving as society is just pack behavior, basic instinct." Drake felt Shadow's mind touch his, sharing memories of generations of pack leaders teaching their young, of complex negotiations between species, of the intricate dance of predator and prey that maintained the world's balance. Through Swift, he felt the future hope of new understanding between species. From the crystal behemoths deep below, he received images of ancient knowledge stored in living crystal networks. "You're wrong," Drake said quietly. The Council was wrong. These beings have culture, memory, dreams. They're not just animals. They're people. Different from us, yes, but no less worthy of respect. "How disappointing," Caldwell sighed, raising her hand to signal the ships above. "I had hoped to avoid complications. Security Protocol 17. Deal with the wildlife. All of it." The harvester's weapons turned toward the ground. In the distance, a massive explosion rocked the crystal plains. Through the network, Drake felt the death of an entire Twilight Reaper nesting ground. Centuries of history, of learned knowledge, gone in an instant. Something broke inside him, or perhaps something finally connected fully. The mental network blazed with his rage and grief, amplified by every being connected to it. Shadow threw back her head and released a roar that shook the crystal trees. Above, the void wraiths screamed their fury. Below, the crystal behemoths began to stir. "You want to see animals?" Drake's voice was deadly quiet, as he felt the combined might of Nexus 427's species rally to his call. "Let me show you what basic instinct really looks like." The war for Nexus 427 was about to begin. Director Caldwell's smug expression faltered as the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The crystal plains, usually a symphony of chiming sounds, had gone deathly silent. Through the mental network, Drake orchestrated what no human had ever achieved: a coordinated response from every major species on Nexus 427. "Last chance," Drake said, his voice carrying the combined weight of countless minds. "Leave this world in peace. Security teams, full containment protocol." Caldwell barked into her comm unit. "Eliminate any hostile wildlife. Protect the mining operations at all costs." As corporate security forces deployed from the ships, Drake's mind touched each of his allies. "Remember, disable, don't destroy. Show them we're not the mindless beasts they think we are." The battle erupted like a storm breaking. From the skies, vast wings blotted out the purple sun as hundreds of void wraiths descended. Their sonic screams shattered crystal formations, creating a glittering rain that confused the ship's targeting systems. Shadow led her pack in a series of precise strikes, moving like living shadows through the chaos. The Twilight Reapers targeted power conduits and communication arrays, their understanding of the technology coming from Drake's shared memories. Each strike was surgical, designed to cripple rather than kill. "Impossible," Caldwell whispered as she watched a pack of Reapers working in perfect sync with a group of their traditional rivals, the Crimson Stalkers. This level of coordination. Underground, the crystal behemoths made their move. The massive creatures burst from beneath key mining positions, their crystalline bodies deflecting energy weapons as they systematically dismantled the mining equipment. Through the network, Drake guided their actions, helping them identify critical weaknesses in the machinery. A security team cornered Swift and two young Reapers. Before Drake could react, a new consciousness joined the network. A colony of crystal weavers, small but numerous creatures that had always stayed hidden before. They swarmed the security team, using their silk-like crystal strands to entangle rather than harm. "You see," Drake projected to every human mind in range, his telepathic voice carrying images of the complex society they were destroying. "Every species here is part of a greater whole. Even those you think are enemies work together when needed." A massive harvester turned its mining beam toward Shadow's position. Drake's warning came instantly through the network, but the pack leader stood her ground. At the last second, a crystal behemoth erupted from below, its body acting as a prism that split the beam into harmless light. The tide turned when the void wraiths began their synchronized attack on the ship's engines. Their natural ability to generate electromagnetic pulses, combined with perfect coordination through the network, allowed them to short out ship after ship. Caldwell stared in horror as her fleet's systems failed. "This is impossible. They're just animals. They can't." "They're not just animals," Drake cut her off. "They're the result of millions of years of evolution on a world that demands both strength and cooperation. Each species here has found its own form of intelligence, its own way of understanding the world. What you see as mindless beasts, I see as one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy." Through the network, Drake felt the moment the corporate forces realized they were beaten. Not just beaten, outmaneuvered by the very creatures they dismissed as mindless. Ships began emergency launch procedures, their crews more than happy to abandon equipment to escape the planet's surface. As the last ships fled into the upper atmosphere, Drake turned to Caldwell, who stood frozen among the wreckage of her operation. "Tell the Council what you saw here. Tell them that Nexus 427 isn't a death world. It's a world where life has found a different path to evolution, one based on connection rather than competition." The director said nothing as she boarded her shuttle, but her expression had changed from contempt to something like awe. Above, the void wraiths flew victory patterns against the purple sky. Below, crystal behemoths began repairing the damage to their ancient networks. And all around, the mental web hummed with a new kind of strength, the power of unity between all species. The crystal spires of the Galactic Council chamber looked different now. Where once they had towered over Drake in judgment, now they seemed like pale imitations of the living crystal forests of Nexus 427. Shadow's massive form moved beside him as he strode through the grand entrance, her crystalline crest scraping the ceiling. Behind them came Swift, two void wraiths, and even a young crystal behemoth, representatives of a world the Council had dismissed as mindless. The chamber erupted in chaos. Council members recoiled, some chattering and reforming in distress, others flickering their holoforms in agitation. High Councilor Vextex remained motionless on his podium, his chrome exoskeleton reflecting the scene before him. Lieutenant Marcus Drake, Vex's metallic voice carried no emotion. "You were exiled to die. Instead, you return with an army of beasts." "Not an army," Drake corrected, his hand resting on Shadow's flank. "A delegation. And not beasts. People. Sentient beings with their own culture, society, and wisdom." The chamber's recording systems projected images above them, footage from the corporate invasion. The Council watched in stunned silence as the creatures of Nexus 427 demonstrated complex strategy, cooperation between species, and most shockingly, mercy toward their attackers. "Impossible." Councilor Zena's holographic form flickered. "Our studies showed no signs of advanced intelligence, no technology, no buildings, no signs that you could recognize," Drake interrupted. Through the mental network, he felt Shadow's amusement. At his signal, the crystal behemoth stepped forward and began to sing. The sound resonated through the chamber, but it was more than just sound. Crystal formations throughout the room began to glow and pulse in response. Data patterns emerged in the light. Mathematical sequences, star maps, historical records. "They don't need buildings," Drake explained. "The entire planet is their library, their communication network, their technology. The crystal formations you dismissed as natural phenomena. Their living data storage, encoding the combined knowledge of multiple species over thousands of years." A younger council member, one Drake didn't recognize, moved forward. "But how? How did you learn to communicate with them?" Drake smiled. "Because I didn't try to force them into our definition of intelligence. I listened, not just with my ears or eyes, but with everything I am. Human emotions, the very thing you condemned as primitive, turned out to be the key to understanding their world." He opened his mind, carefully extending the mental network to include the council chamber. Not full contact. Many species here weren't ready for that, but enough to let them feel the edge of it. The vast, living web of consciousness that connected the beings of Nexus 427. Several council members gasped. Others went still, processing this new reality. Vex stood from his podium, his mechanical movements more hesitant than before. "We were wrong," the High Councilor said, each word seeming to cost him. "Our pursuit of pure logic, it blinded us to other forms of advanced life. The question now," Drake said, "is what you're going to do about it." Swift stepped forward, his multiple eyes scanning the chamber. Through their connection, Drake felt the young Reaper's curiosity about these strange beings who had sent his friend into exile. There was no hatred in that alien mind, only a desire to understand. "They're offering you something remarkable," Drake translated for the council. "A chance to learn, to grow, to remember that the galaxy is vast enough for many kinds of intelligence, many paths to evolution." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the young council member who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. "I request permission to visit Nexus 427, to learn." Others joined, first a few, then more. Even Zena's holographic form showed signs of interest. Vex remained silent, but his optical sensors had shifted from cold blue to a warmer hue. "Welcome," Drake said, both aloud and through the network, "to a new chapter in galactic history. One where we finally learn to see with more than just our eyes." Above them, the Void Wraiths began a victory dance, their wings casting ever-changing shadows through the crystal chamber. The future had never looked more promising, or more beautifully wild. 5 years after the Council's reckoning, the crystal plains of Nexus 427 sparkled under the light of 3 moons. Lieutenant Marcus Drake, now known throughout the galaxy as the first Beastmaster, stood before a group of wide-eyed human students. Behind him, Shadow lounged regally, her crystalline spines having grown even more magnificent with age. "Welcome to your first day at the Beastmaster Academy," Drake announced, both verbally and through the mental network. "You're here because you showed the potential for something remarkable, the ability to bridge worlds." The students, 20 in total, had been selected from thousands of applicants. Each had demonstrated both the emotional intelligence and mental flexibility necessary to potentially connect with Nexus 427's complex ecosystem. A young woman raised her hand. "Sir, the Council educational programs taught us that evolution means moving beyond emotion. But you're saying—" "I'm saying they had it backwards," Drake smiled, feeling Shadow's amusement through their bond. "True evolution isn't about cutting away parts of ourselves. It's about building bridges between different ways of being." On cue, Swift, now fully grown and a pack leader himself, led his hunters past the group in a demonstration of coordinated movement. Above, a formation of Void Wraiths painted pictures in the sky with their bioluminescent trails. From below, the crystal behemoths sent pulses of data through the living crystal networks, creating a symphony of light and knowledge. "What you're seeing," Drake continued, "is the most advanced neural network in known space, not built with circuits and code, but grown through millions of years of evolution. Every crystal formation, every creature, every wind pattern is part of a vast, living library of experience." He led the group toward the Academy's central structure, a massive crystal spire that had been grown, not built, through cooperation between humans and Nexus 427's native species. Inside, Council scientists worked alongside Beastmaster candidates, learning to access the crystal memory networks. "Your training won't be easy," Drake warned. "You'll need to unlearn much of what you think you know about intelligence, about communication, about life itself. But the rewards—" He gestured to where a graduate student was deep in mental communion with a circle of crystal weavers, their combined consciousness creating beautiful patterns in the nearby crystal walls. A memory rose in Drake's mind, shared through his bond with Shadow. His first days on this world, alone and expected to die. How far they'd come since then. The Council had intended Nexus 427 to be his tomb. Instead, it had become a beacon of hope for the entire galaxy. "Some of you will bond with the Twilight Reapers, like I did," Drake explained. "Others might find their connection with the Void Wraiths, or the Crystal Behemoths, or species we haven't even fully understood yet. Each bond is unique, just as each of you is unique." Through the network, He felt the approach of a council delegation, young members who had embraced the new way of thinking. They too had started learning to access the crystal networks, though few could achieve the deep bonds that humans seemed particularly suited for. "The galaxy is changing," Drake said, watching his students' faces light up with possibility. "The old divisions between civilized and wild, between logical and emotional, between advanced and primitive, they're all breaking down. And you'll be part of that change." Shadow raised her head, adding her own thoughts to the lesson. Through Drake, the students felt her perspective, the joy of the hunt, the power of pack bonds, the deep wisdom of ancient crystal songs. It was just a taste of what awaited them. "Remember this," Drake concluded, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "They exiled me here to die, thinking this world was nothing but death and chaos. Instead, I found something beautiful, a different kind of civilization, a different kind of wisdom. Your job isn't to tame this world or master these beings. Your job is to learn from them, to grow with them, to help build bridges between all the different forms of life that share our galaxy." As if to emphasize his point, the crystal plains began to sing their evening song, a symphony of light and sound and consciousness that reached to the stars themselves. The legacy of the Beastmaster had only just begun.